Well, hello and welcome to the podcast that actually, as yet, has no name. I am Andy Bannister. I wear various hats, including running the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity up in Scotland, and I do a bit of writing and speaking and various other things. And I'm joined by two great friends of mine, Aaron Edwards, who also wears various hats, including teaching at Cliff College down in Derbyshire, and Michael Otts, who wears various hats, including paddling on the River Thames and being an evangelist. And gentlemen, welcome to the welcome. It's all of our show anyway, but great to have you on this first podcast. Aaron, Michael, how are you doing today?
Well, yeah, all right, thank you.
Yeah, now, very good, thank you.
Very good. Now, here's the thing. I said just a moment ago, this podcast has no name. So there's a story here before we dig into today's topic, right? This podcast, until a minute ago, had a name. It was going to be called What Kind of Podcast, which we thought was clever and subversive and a little bit pomo and various other things. And then Michael Otts, literally 30 seconds before I press the record button, goes, actually, I got a better idea. Why don't we call it Three Men in a Podcast? Michael, what's going on? What's with Three Men in a Podcast? And why do you prefer that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what kind of podcast? I didn't want to be a bit arrogant and try and be sounding like I was selling my books or anything like that, because obviously it's similar to a book that I may have written once. But yeah, I do live about 100 meters from the River Thames, so we thought, Three Men in a Boat, Three Men in a Podcast could work.
Yeah. So, Aaron, where do you stand on this? What kind of podcast? Three Men in a Podcast? What do you think?
I did watch Three Men and a Baby and Three Men and a Little Lady growing up. So clearly there are, childhood memories of those. Is it Tom Selleck? Was he in that?
It was, yeah. Him of what was the detective he played for a while? My brain's gone completely. Magnum. He was Magnum.
Yes, he was. And he was also on Friends, wasn't he? He was Richard on Friends.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah. So, that I don't know if I wondered is that enough of a draw? Have people seen those films and have they got them in their head? I don't know, but it does. I think it's quite good.
If you've not read Three Men in a Boat, you've got to basically. You've not really, it's a classic.
Yeah. Well, I think what we're going to do, because rather than fill an entire podcast with a discussion about what to call the podcast, because what our two listeners are probably already thinking about going and doing something more interesting, like watching paint dry. We'll do a vote. I think we'll do a vote on social media and stuff, and we'll see how many millions of votes we get for the two titles. And then hopefully, when this by the time we go to episodes 3 or 4, the podcast with no name will have a name. Right. Well, today, let's get on to the more serious stuff. The podcast with no name, but we'll have that name eventually. We thought we'd set this thing up because we felt that that Aaron and Michael and I thought we needed a podcast that really talked about the big issues of culture, some of the big challenges that face Christians, living in the 21st century with all that's going on. And there are lots of shows out there that talk about that from a secular perspective. There's brilliant stuff out there, but not a lot that we found doing that from a unapologetically Christian perspective. So today we want to look at the whole issue of church over the next kind of half an hour or so, because obviously with the COVID pandemic, that's affected church in a huge way. Where I live in Scotland, churches can't meet. Church are very limited in England and other parts of the UK. And of course, lots of churches have moved online and using Zoom and so forth. But the question I want to think about, and I might start with Aaron's take on this, and then Michael come to you. I think a question that lurks behind the scenes here, Aaron, is what is church? Is it the building? Is it the people? Is it just a delivery mechanism for a sermon, and so you can just go online and download it digitally? Or is there some aspect of church that isn't actually church unless there is some kind of physical connectivity and meeting together? You're a professional theologian and troublemaker, so what do you think? What's your take on that?
Yeah, always good to be a professional troublemaker. Like the apostles themselves, of course. I think, yeah, you're right that there's this last year has certainly thrown up this question of what is church in fresh ways. I mean, many people have already been thinking about it in other avenues, but for almost the entire church, they've had to think about this question. People in the pews, even though they can't sit on pews at the moment, who are having to think, not just leaders going, right, what do we do? How do we structure things? What do we give priority to in our meetings, in our gatherings? Everyone's starting to think, hang on, what is this thing? And I think it's been such a drive towards the sort of Zoom conferencing and the the ways in which we can get really good tech going. So there's certain churches that have been almost privileged in that position because they have really good tech guys who can get stuff up and running really quickly. And so therefore we've gotten used to doing this very quickly just to kind of solve the pragmatic solution. And people are getting kind of comfortable with it. So it does raise all these issues, kind of like, is this okay? And then post-pandemic, can we just go back to this because it's a lot more convenient for people, they might think, and all the rest of it. And I think it depends on what your denomination is or your church background, church tradition is, as to whether this is going to cause more of a problem. So there's certain evangelical churches, especially sort of free churches, for whom it's not as big a deal because they are already used to speaking about the church not being a building. They don't have a particularly high view of the sacraments, for example, in terms of baptism and communion or the Eucharist. And so the physical gathering of space in a certain space doesn't have as much of a sort of sacred draw to it. It's always about the people connecting outside of the Sunday meeting. But there's other denominations where the Sunday gathering is so vital, and it's important that it's on a Sunday, and it's important that they gather and hear the preaching of the word and share the sacraments together. And they even sometimes meet twice. You get Presbyterian churches. In Scotland, I was in a Presbyterian church for a while, which met twice, and the pastor had to prepare 2 sermons for the morning and the evening because their view is it's all about that Sunday gathering, and that punctuates the week and it sets them up, and they have a theology as to why that matters. Whereas there's others that it doesn't matter so much at all. So you can just take it all away, all of the kind of trappings, and do it all online. It doesn't seem to make a difference to how that works. But I think when we do that, we sort of end up losing the importance of that one-to-one physicality, which is important. I think last time we all spoke about this, I was referring to 2 and 3 John, where there's those little notes at the end of those letters. There's very short letters, but that hardly anyone bothers reading. Where he does say, I'm writing to you with pen and ink or with paper and ink, but I long to see you face to face. And he means face to face right there, not face to face on Zoom or whatever equivalent would be. So although it's good to use the technologies we have available, I do think they sometimes impinge upon what church really is when you're talking about people coming together, knowing each other, being accountable in a particular place, and doing mission together where they are in that place as well. Those things are really key. And I think some of those things kind of end up drifting off. So there's obviously lots more to say, but I'll just pause myself there. You can jump onto Michael.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I mean, there's a couple of things I want to come back on you there on Aaron, but so it'd be good to bring Tim Michael in. I described you as a professional troublemaker. I guess that therefore makes Michael an unprofessional troublemaker. But there we are. Michael, obviously, you're an evangelist like I am, and I've got your mind and your focus often set on those outside the church. And one question occurred to me as I was thinking about this: is there an issue with church as churches moved online because of the pandemic? Is there an issue around the whole idea of church as public witness? Is there something about the church that when you're meeting out there in the public square, people can see that folks are going into church on Sunday? The church can have its doors flung open, but if your church has become a private Zoom link that isn't there in the public square, have we lost something in terms of our outreach and our communication into the world? What do you think?
Yeah, I think you could see it one of 2 ways. I mean, you could turn it around and say, well, actually, having stuff online has made the church more accessible to some people. Certainly, some of our neighbours and friends have been to church for the first time during the pandemic. I say go to church as in like inverted commas. Obviously, it's online, and certainly even before the pandemic, people would have often tried before they buy, in the sense of like where churches put a kind of online stream, a lot of people would often check that out before they turned up to the building. So I'm not saying it's kind of like we're going underground. There are ways of making it quite visible even when we're online. But I guess the flip side to that is to say, if we just kind of close our doors and say like it's fine, we can basically effectively close down, then what does that say about the importance of the church to those outside it? We believe that things that are essential have to stay open. And when people walk past the church that's just closed up again for another 2-3 months or whatever, does that basically communicate that those who are in the church see this as a kind of non-essential activity? And I think that's concerning. We all need to go to Tesco's, we all need to do certain things, but actually does the church say, well, we don't really need to keep meeting in that way?
Yeah, that essential thing is really interesting, because that really hit us as a family personally recently, because we've been meeting because churches can't properly meet here in Scotland. We've been doing outdoor church with one other family, so very, very restricted. Meeting outdoors on a Sunday, just us and the kids. So so it's totally kind of COVID safe. But last Sunday the weather was really bad, and so we were on the verge of calling it off. And then one of us went, "Hang on a moment, Christians in North Korea can literally, run the risk of life and limb. They're willing to, meet in like public lavatories and lavatories in prison camps, or in, really, really dingy circumstances to meet safely. And they're so hungry to meet, they'll do that. And here's us, as Western Christians going, oh, it looks like rain today, so we won't do church." And that really got us thinking about: is there an issue about how essential church is for us as Christians? Maybe as Western Christians, we become a little bit lazy, and church is like, it's a nice thing to do, but you know what? It can't happen right now, so I'll just substitute it with a podcast. Or am I being too? I'm including myself in that, so I'm not beating up on the church here. That was a kind of wake up call for us. Am I onto something?
No, absolutely. And I think sometimes you don't realise the importance of something until you don't have it. And I think I hope that maybe one of the positives that comes out of this pandemic and all that's happened is that people value the importance of being able to physically gather as a church, and what that does for us. And I think not having something, and we've realised that actually there's so much that you just can't replicate online. Yeah, you can listen to a talk, you can, you can have certain aspects and try and recreate them online, but not being physically together, you are missing something significant, and we're starting to realize that. So I think in the beginning of the pandemic, people were thinking, oh, it's great, we can do church online, this is just going to be the way it is from now on. Whereas I wonder whether we've kind of come full circle to the point of saying, okay, we've had that for quite a while now, and actually we now appreciate what we didn't have. And my prayer would be that we actually, when we can go back and not be socially distanced and everything else, and be able to really enjoy that and to appreciate that and to make the most of that in a way that maybe we've taken for granted in the West particularly. But like you say, for other parts of the world, that's been something that they've had to cherish because it's been under threat, and we haven't had it under threat until this year. So that could be a positive.
Yeah.
I think I was just going to jump in, Michael, on the stuff about you mentioning earlier about the opportunities for local mission as well, and engaging in the local area. That's another one of these things that's been spotlighted, isn't it? Because we've had to, because we've been limited to our closer proximity, people in there have got to know their neighbours more. They've been able to engage with them in evangelistically in loads of ways. We've had some wonderful conversations with people, and it sort of feels more appropriate to be doing that. You've been forced to do it, but many people in churches, rather than driving across 10 miles or whatever to across the city, or 5 miles across their city to the church they go to, they're actually just focusing missionally on those around them. And I think churches are starting to think intentionally. Our church, for example, is doing that. It's trying to, how do we organize people in hubs where they actually are, live in closer proximity, so that mission can be a little bit more coordinated where you are. And that's one of those things that's been really helpful. But it does help us think again about also the physical space, or physical kind of gatherings. Why do we meet physically? Because we've often never had to think about why that matters. And sometimes you kind of go to church and it almost doesn't matter that you were there physically. And so we're now to go, right, why is it good to be there physically? Is there a good reason for this? Or can we just do it, as you say, Andy, download something on Zoom as an equivalent, and you can probably find a better sermon online. You could find a better worship time. You could cultivate or curate your own worship service, which is of a great standard, but it's not the same because you're not in a community. There aren't people who know you. And then there's no sort of sense of continuity there. So and you're totally in control of the process. And that's sort of one of the issues, isn't it? That we don't.
Yeah. And I think on that, just to pick up on that, and happy for Aaron, you to come back on this, or Michael, you jump in. What you said there, and something you said earlier, reminded me of the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan. Often sort of known as the sort of father of media theory. Is famous for that little quote. The medium is the message.
Yeah.
By which he meant, as people often misunderstood what he means. What he meant by that, I think, is that the medium by which a message is conveyed restricts and shapes to some way, what is conveyed. And a good example of that would be things like Twitter. You can't have a substantive conversation on Twitter. The very nature of the 280 character limit and the type of communication it is ends up restricting what you can do. And I do wonder whether we're learning this in the church right now around things like Zoom. As you say, there are some great things we can do. There are some things that maybe we can do we couldn't do before, but there's also a whole range of things we can't do because certain things just can't be digitized and brought into that space. And of course, I'm quite intrigued, I think, and more increasingly interested in how, we haven't so much moved our church services on Zoom as allowed Zoom to shape the kind of church services that we have as the medium has become the message.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's issues about technology, and you mentioned McLuhan and those, there's Neil Postman and others who have made these sort of for years been making these sort of observations about Western culture and the way in which our entertainment platforms, even pre-social media, but then how much more so post-social media, are affecting the way we live our lives in all these different ways. And I think in terms of, it's one of those things again where the church has been running behind, kind of caught napping almost, realizing, we haven't thought about this. Right, we're in a crisis. Let's jump on all the technology and sit. And I presume we'll just use it as a tool, because no church leader goes up and goes, right, I want this to fundamentally shape the identity of what we're doing. Everyone will always use things as an instrument and try to take advantage and use it as a tool. But the tools so often do end up shaping the center, the core, without people realizing that's sort of the nature of it. But I do think there's another side to that as well, obviously, because we've got to be aware that technology is not something to be clearly scared of. It's something the church has used in all sorts of different ways. Even the way we have scripture coming to us, obviously, is a form of technology which wasn't available to the earliest church. Even the way that we pick up a Bible, what a blessing that is to pick up a 66 books of the Bible. Well, Paul is talking to Timothy about passing on. Go and pick up the scrolls and manuscripts that I've got here, that I left over here. So please, can you bring them with you? And reading the Bible in scroll form is even different to reading it in codices, which came later. And then people at the time would have gone, it's so different now because you can't read it in the scroll. There's something about the scroll that was sacred. And that happens almost every generation with the printing press and all the rest of it. So I guess this could be something like that, where we should just be thanking God for the blessing of the technology. I think we do need to, that has to be a healthy approach to technology. But the other side we just always forget is that, as I say, the medium does become the message, and churches get into that before they've even realized it. We get into the habit of just aping whatever the world does and just doing it a little bit worse, and trying to kind of stay on top of the game so that we seem like we're keeping going. But what are we actually keeping going is the challenge. And that's where, going back to scripture continually about what is the church supposed to be as the body of Christ, as these gifts brought together by the Holy Spirit to kind of encourage one another and to challenge one another in these ways. How do we keep on that, whilst we're trying to keep things going for the sake of our institutions or whatever?
I think just to pick up on that, Aaron, I think it's interesting. I've often, when we've done university missions, said, the reason why we put on meals and invite people to come and have food before they hear a talk is not just because we're bribing poor students to come and come to an event because they can't afford to eat. Although, it does have a certain, attractiveness to a bankrupt students, but actually because we're trying to basically demonstrate something of the gospel by the event that we're putting on. The gospel says, the gospel is an invitation to a feast, isn't it? That's one of the analogies, the metaphors of the gospel that we see in scripture. And so sitting there together, enjoying a meal together is actually adorning and illustrating the very message you're trying to communicate. And then I was thinking, what is the gospel? Well, the gospel, you mentioned 2 and 3 John, but of course, John starts his gospel by saying, the word becomes flesh. He starts his letters by talking about, the one that we've seen and touched. And there's a sense of the incarnation is really important to the whole gospel. It's God who becomes physical. And so when we suddenly take our message and we detach it and we make it non-physical, actually, instead of underlining our message, we're undermining it, you might say, because we're actually communicating. When you sit and do something physical like having a meal, you're communicating even more powerfully what you're saying. But actually, that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, Andy, can I just jump on just on the back of that? It's a really good point, Michael, just to say about the physicality thing. And as someone who's an evangelical charismatic, we do have a tendency in our church tradition to make things a little bit more like Gnostic, kind of flesh bad, spirit good. And so we end up thinking almost, when you go to church, you go and partake in the worship time and you close your eyes the entire time. You might do. And you're engaging one-on-one with God, but you just happen to be in the same room as everyone else. And so you almost end up thinking, what is the value of being here physically, when you can have your engagement with God on this spiritual level separately. And I think there's loads of things. I mean, different churches do things in different ways to gather that. But it's all about, as you say, Mike, bringing back what does it mean to be physical and spiritual as the church. It's a huge, huge thing.
No, you're right. And I think what's interesting, Aaron, I'm very interested that you mentioned the kind of term Gnosticism, which for folks who are not familiar with that's the kind of ancient kind of sort of Greek idea that, the material world, this world of stuff is bad. The world of spirit and mind is good. And basically your job as a religious person is you want to get away from the material world and into the spiritual world. And Christians have fallen into that trap. I mean, I remember, sort of picking up the idea as a young Christian that, the whole point about being a Christian was to escape this world and float on in heaven, playing a sort of virtual harp or something. And to get whatever that is, that's not the gospel. But it is interesting that I think Christians, we've always struggled with this. We struggled with that, in church history where that temptation came along. We struggle with it in worship services. Sometimes we struggle with it in sometimes in churches where we put an overemphasis on the sermon, and it's all about the sermon. It's all about getting that mental content into your head. But there's something about biblical spirituality that, as you say, is grounded and earthy. Jesus, came in the flesh. He didn't come and float around as a spirit. When he rose from the dead with this resurrection body that wasn't sort of immaterial such that it could pass through doors. It was more that it's more physical than the doors. Yeah. C.S. Lewis's kind of point. What does he do with his disciples? He sits and has breakfast with them. All the resurrection appearances have that physical quality. And then as the New Testament church begins, meeting together and being in person in twos and threes and larger groups is absolutely important. There's that earthy quality, isn't there, to I think to Christian discipleship that we lose at our peril, I guess.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that there's something, funnily enough, it reminds me of something we used to run here at Cliff College a few years ago before I arrived here, where there's a module in pioneering mission, and the assessment for this module, we kind of got rid of it quite soon on because we realized there were kind of ethical issues. The assessment was you had to set up a church online as the assessment for the module. And obviously students liked that because it meant they had a way of actually, engaging with the content of the course and practically putting it into action by actually doing the stuff in those the old John Wimber terms. So they're not just talking about it in theory. And so it was nice that they got to do that. But the problem was none of these churches ever ended up being anything. And they you could also have the ethical issue of people setting up a church purely to pass an assessment. They don't actually care about the people. And it was interesting that that was happening. Those kind of reflections on online church have been happening for about 20 years, and people kind of thinking and reflecting on them, but usually off to the side because we've had to have it all in the kind of foreground now with everything going on. It's meant that we're almost drifting into that automatically. But when we did take that unit away, that kind of module, we had people sometimes saying, "Oh, why have you taken that away? I thought that was a fantastic module." And I'd ask the person, "Did you do that module when you were here?" It's like, yeah, it was great. So did you set up an online church? Yeah, it was brilliant. I got a good mark for that one. Is your church still going? And no, of course not. And they never still go because those things, there's such an easy buy-in. There's also an easy exit. So it doesn't do that. And part of that's what you're saying, Andy. The stuff about the physicality means there's a buy-in that you've kind of committed to, isn't it?
Yeah. Two things. I've got two more things I want to talk about in our kind of remaining kind of sort of 10 minutes or so, both of which we've kind of touched on in different ways, but I'd like to dig down into a little bit more detail here. So either of you folks can pick up on this first one. I was early on in the lockdown. I had the privilege of doing an interview for Christianity Today with N.T. Wright. It's great to name drop, isn't it? I'm only asking this question because I could then drop that in and go, I got to talk to
were you talking to NT Wright or were you talking to Tom Wright? I mean, like,
well, I know
it's level of conversation. I mean, that's even more.
He's a funny guy. Most times through the interview, he was going, "So remind me, who are you again?" Which was good for my humility. He said something at that interview that really intrigued me. He was talking about online church. We covered that in the interview, and he said, "Look, I think, as he put it, e-church, electronic church, has so many good things going for it and so many things it can help us with, especially right now in the pandemic." He said, "But my worry is that e-church very easily becomes p-church, personal church, and to go suddenly church now becomes on your terms. You listen to it. I've had people say to me, "Oh, I love online church right now because I don't listen to it live. I listen to the sermon, in the bath or in my pajamas while doing the washing up, and or I think one of you earlier said, you can go and curate your own church. You get the worship from perhaps sort of Vineyard or something where you really like their worship, and then you go get a sermon from Tim Keller because he's really great, and you mash it all together. But it's all on your terms. And I wonder if that worries me slightly, because isn't there something about church that actually needs to be not on our terms, and maybe is inconvenient to us? Because part of the job of church is to kind of knock the edges off our character as we are made into disciples and following Christ. So how do we stop E-church becoming P-church, as Tom or NT, depending on what mood you're in, suggested?
Aaron, go for it.
I'll go for it. Yeah, no, I thought I'd spoken too much. I thought I was giving you, but yeah, I think it's something that, as I think some of the stuff we've already been saying, really, to say that there has to be buy-in. There has to be a sense in which it's costly, like Bonhoeffer's term of costly discipleship. You don't want cheap grace, where you're sort of saying, right, it's just easy to join and everything's completely fine. We for too long, probably churches made a situation where we're so desperate to get people in the door or on the roster that we lower the bar for everything. I don't mean like we should raise the bar in terms of creating some reversion of the Old Testament covenant or something, but I mean the sense in which we sell the church via our websites and things like that as the best church with the best coffee, with the youngest people, the coolest people. We've got Andy Bannister, we've got a Michael Otts, kind of in touch with culture, and all the websites look the same. I find it odd that almost all sort of evangelical church websites look roughly the same. They almost get the same kind of designer to do it almost, and it does convey a kind of message about we are selling you a product and you are consuming this product, and you can come and be part of this, and it is a real thing. They're not pretending they're not trying to make consumers, but it just indirectly does become that, because it's all on your terms, and it's it appeals to your own kind of assumptions about what church should be. So that equally, if you can be that choosy about which church you join because you like this or that, or the kids' work's good here or not good there, whatever, you can equally leave it and just hop around and go to another one. I think we have that as a huge problem in the West in ways, you mentioned North Korea earlier, Andy. They don't have the luxury to just sort of choose from several churches in their local area that they can just choose based on whether they like the preacher or not. And that's kind of it's a scary thought for the church in the West, because so many of us are in churches, and I don't want to. There could be more awkward questions about there's a theological concept of the visible and the invisible church, which can relate to those who are believers that you don't know if they're believers or not. But there's also those who you think might be believers but aren't, and there might be a fair few more of those than we'd realize in the Western church at large, because it's an easy buy-in, so it's an easy buy-out.
Absolutely.
Helpful. Yeah. Okay. I've got one last question, and since Aaron, you've talked a lot, and Michael is such. For those who know him, he is such an introvert. Getting him to say anything is really, really tough. Whereas Aaron, it's more like Donkey and Shrek. Getting him to stop is the challenge. But it's great being the host for a week. I know next time we're going to have someone else hosting, and I'll be on the
yeah. We'll see what happens then.
Well, I've got the power. I shall use it. Maybe Michael have a go at this one. One last question I wanted to think about was a very interesting story that I was talking to a friend of mine whose church obviously had to stop because of lockdown, as many churches have, and they've now begun. They've got a committee figuring out the reopening stuff, and his wife is a busy medic, and has been on the diaconate for some years. And early on in this discussion around reopening, said, look, whatever happens with the reopening, it can't go back to the old way. Should I burnt myself out? For the last 20 years, I have done so many things at church whilst being a busy GP, and I'm exhausted. And I've quite enjoyed lockdown, actually, because it's just been a chance to breathe. And then she wanted to say, look, I think one of the challenges in our church is that we've made the Sunday morning the centre of everything, and we've all become slaves to that. How can we rethink some things so that maybe more people are involved? Perhaps we don't try and be as professional. And so that actually church on a Sunday can be something everyone enjoys, rather than a few people work so stupidly hard and the rest sit there and do nothing. I remember thinking, wow, there's so many things in there about some of the ways we've done church, particularly the way that maybe we've made Sunday morning, that the kind of thing that consumes everything else. All the resources go into the Sunday morning service, and then we begin forgetting about things like discipleship and small groups and youth work and evangelism and stuff. Is there, one of the positives in this, a real opportunity to rethink some ways that we do church so that it's more liberating and refreshing, rather than a rod that breaks some people's backs? Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was interesting. I was just chatting to someone quite recently. They're saying, we've found a way of doing church that's become more and more onerous, that takes, bigger and bigger staff teams, bigger and bigger finances, just to try and operate, and actually we're pouring all of these resources in, but what are we actually achieving? What are we actually doing through that, other than maintaining a structure and a system? So I don't know. I think for us, personal reflection, for us, the best thing about the first lockdown especially was not actually the online church services that we watched. We really didn't get much out of those, but actually what we really found beneficial was just a small group. We met once a week. Someone took it in turns to share something devotionally from scripture. We shared how we were doing, we prayed for each other, and it took about an hour, but actually that was a really precious time each week. And actually that struck me, because actually if you think about all the kind of the one another's of the New Testament, so many of the one another's we can't do on a Sunday morning anyway, when we just sit and watch a show. They are the kind of things that require interaction, probably small groups, things like that. And so maybe the rediscovery of the value of small groups, I think, has been a really significant thing during this time, because Zoom works well for a small group, particularly a very small group, 5 or 6 people. It's a lot harder when you're dealing with massive numbers. So the value of small groups, I think, has been key. I think someone else said something recently that struck me. They said, out of all the things that we've done on Zoom, prayer meetings are probably about the best thing, because they don't take lots of organisation. They don't take, they're not a big show, and people are involved. They're going there to pray, not just to listen or to watch. And so maybe a rediscovery of prayer through that. So certainly participation is key. And it'll be interesting to see, how things come out of this as things start to open up again. I certainly don't feel we'll just be reverting to, the way we were. Hopefully there will be lessons learned through it.
Well, it's been a fantastic discussion over the last half hour. We've covered so much in there. So Aaron and Michael, just thanks for taking the time. It's been really great to be together as the three of us discussing this. So thanks for all of your contributions.
Thank you.
And for all of you listening at home, I hope you found this helpful. This is very much an experimental podcast. We haven't even got a name yet. We're not sure how regularly we'll be broadcasting, and we don't even know whether Michael will be allowed back on this after some of the things he said. We can see the phones lighting up already. But we do hope we're doing this from time to time, taking a look at some of the big issues of the day and chewing around them from a Christian perspective. So until next time, stay safe, and we hope to be with you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.